Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to calculate the variance and standard deviation using Excel. So we're going to take a look at the example involving the Jefferson Valley Bank and the Bank of Providence. So for these two banks, they took a sampling of waiting times for their customers, and they're listed right here in our data set. Each bank took a sampling of 10 customers, and these were their waiting times. And we want to calculate the variance and standard deviation for these values. So I'll show you two ways how to do this. One of them is just using an Excel command, and then we'll also do it by hand to show you how the formula works. So first of all, we have our data entered into Excel over here. We already have our mean calculated at 7.15 for each data set, and once again that is just using the average function. Now the variance and standard deviation are pretty easy. For the standard deviation, we're going to use this function, equals stdev. Now we have a lot of choices here. We want to use the stdev.s function. That's for sample standard deviation. Most of the time, that's the one you want to use, because most of the time your data comes from a sampling and not the entire population. If you had the data from every score in the entire population, you would use stdev.p. So we want to use stdev.s for standard deviation from a sample. So we use that one. We just highlight our values here, close off the parenthesis, and hit enter. And there you go. There is our sample standard deviation for the Jefferson Valley Bank, 0.477. If we wanted the variance, we could square that number or just do equals var.s for variance from a sampling. And there we go, 0.227. And that is the square of this number. You notice if I evaluated what's in cell B14 and I square it, I will get the variance. We can do the same thing for the Bank of Providence. In fact, I can just copy these cells right over here. And there we go. We have our standard deviation for the Bank of Providence and our sample variance for the Bank of Providence. Notice how the standard deviation for the Bank of Providence is much larger than that of the Jefferson Valley Bank, indicating that the scores in the Bank of Providence have a lot more variation in them, as you can see, than the Jefferson Valley Bank scores. So that's how you can calculate the sample standard deviation and the sample variance using Excel. And once again, if you wanted to calculate the population standard deviation and population variance, if you had every score in your population, you would use the .p function in Excel. Now, I just want to show you how we can get these same numbers by doing this by hand. So if we go back to the formula here for standard deviation and variance, right here is our formula. Maybe make that a little bit bigger so you can see. So right here is our formula for the sample variance, and then the square root is going to be the sample standard deviation. Now you notice what we have to do is take each score, subtract the mean from it, and square it. And then we add all those up and divide by the number of scores we have minus 1. So we're going to create, let's do this for each one. Let's do this for the Jefferson Valley Bank. Let's see, I'm going to give myself a little more room here. So what we're going to put right here is the x1 minus the mean, which is x bar. So I'm going to type in here equals parenthesis B3 minus what is in cell B13. That's the mean that we calculated. Square it. And there we go. So what we have right here, that 0.4225, that is x1 minus x bar squared. Now we have to do the same thing for each of them, so we'll just copy this down. There we go. Now what we have to do is add up all of these scores. When we add them all up, that's what will be in the numerator, and then we have to divide by 9, which is 10 minus 1 in our case. In our case, we have 10 scores. So if I add all of them up, now that's going to be my variance, so I'll equals sum of all of these values, and I divide by 9, 10 minus 1, and I should get this 0.227 number. There we go, same thing. For the standard deviation, we could just take the square root of this number, or we can do this again, equals, but now we want the square root, so I'm going to go SQRT of the sum of all of these values, parenthesis, divide by 9, close that parenthesis off, and you see what we have entered right here is this formula right here. And there you go. Same thing that we have over here. And that's how you can calculate the standard deviation and variance by hand. You just have to calculate in your spreadsheet each of these values, copy them down, and then just sum all of them up, divide by n minus 1, and take the square root if you want the standard deviation. And then we could do the exact same thing for the Bank of Providence as well, but it's the exact same procedure that we did over here, just with these scores. And you'll see we get the same numbers down here. And there you go. That's how you can calculate the variance and standard deviation from a data set. Now here we're going to look at how to calculate the variance and standard deviation from weighted data. So suppose we're given a data set with values x1 through xn with corresponding weights w1 through wn. Now once again, you can think of the weights as representing how many times each score is counted in your data set. Now the formula for the sample variance and standard deviation are given by these two formulas right here. So this is your formula for the sample variance from a weighted data set, and then you just take the square root of it to get your standard deviation. Now you notice it looks a lot like the formulas that we've seen previously for the variance and standard deviation, except we multiply each xi minus x bar squared by the weight wi. And then instead of dividing by n minus 1, well, the n is represented by the sum of the weights. And then the standard deviation, we just take the square root of that value. Now let's take a look at this example. So down here, we have a table that summarizes the number of surface flaws found on the paintwork of new cars following their inspection after primer paint was applied by a new method. So in this column we have the number of flaws, 0 through 4, appearing on a car. And over here in this column we have the number of cars that exhibited these particular number of flaws. So for this set, we think of the number of flaws as being our scores xi, and we think of the number of cars exhibiting these flaws as being our weights wi. So you see we had 3 cars with 0 flaws, so 0 occurred 3 times. We had 7 cars with 1 flaw in the paintwork, so 1 is counted 7 times in our data set, and so on. So to calculate the sample variance and standard deviation, we use these 2 formulas. And now keep in mind, we need to first calculate the sample mean using the method that we had previously done for the sample mean from a weighted data set. So let's take a look at how we calculate these. So the first thing we need to do is calculate the weighted mean. And so right here is our weighted mean. You notice we have the 3 right here is W1, and the 0 is X1, 7 is W2, and the 1 is X2, and so on. And then we divide by the sum of the weights. In other words, we had 27 total cars. And when we evaluate this, we get 1.926 approximately. Then to calculate the sample variance, down here is our formula. So you see we evaluate right here, we have x1 minus the mean, the weighted mean, squared, and then we multiply by W1. Over here we have x2 minus the mean, squared, and then we multiply by W2. And so on. And then we divide by the sum of the weights minus 1. That's for the sample variance. Now when we evaluate this, what we get is 1.3789. And then taking the square root of that, we get our sample standard deviation. Now keep in mind when you're typing this formula into a calculator, and over here we'll show you how to do it using Excel, you should carry pretty many decimal places for this value up here for your weighted mean. You should carry out more than just 3 decimal places. I just use 3 decimal places here because if I carried it out more it would run off the side of the screen here. So you should carry as many decimal places for the weighted mean here as you can when evaluating this quantity. Now over here, let's see how we can do this using Excel. So what you want to do is create a table of your scores. Right here we have the first column, we have our scores. Right here are the weights. Now the first thing we need to do is calculate the mean. Okay, so right here is our weighted mean, and the way we did that is we used the sum product. So you notice I calculated the sum product of column A times column B, and then I divided by the sum of column B. That represents the sum of your weights. That's also given right here, 27. That's just the sum of the weights. So you could also, in this formula right here for the mean, instead of having this sum right here, you could type in 27. Now, to calculate the variance and standard deviation, we have to create another column. So right here, we have a column representing Wi times xi minus x bar squared divided by the sum of the weights minus 1. So let me show you what this formula is. So you see what we have here is this B2 represents our first weight times A2 represents our first score minus what's in cell B8, which is our weighted mean. Notice I have dollar signs here so that when I copy this formula down, the cell reference for B8 does not change. You could also type in by hand here if you wanted 1.9259259. Just make sure you carry out many decimal places. Then we square it and we divide by the sum of the weights minus 1. So notice we have 26 here. That is 27 minus 1. I could also put a cell reference in here to cell B7 minus 1. So I could put in here $ B $7 minus 1 with parentheses around it instead of just typing in the number 26. Now what we have to do is just copy that down. So now once you have that typed in, that formula, you can just grab the fill handle, copy it down. Okay. And then what we have to do is sum all of these numbers up, add them all up. So down here, you notice we have the formula where we're summing all of them up. This is our weighted sample variance. And then right here, we just take the square root of this number. So you notice I just took the square root of the sum of what's in column C here. And that gives us our weighted sample standard deviation. And that's it. So that's how you can use Excel to calculate the weighted sample variance and sample standard deviation from a data set.